Every deep drawn breath is about telling the story of real people and real research, medical history, and the personal aspects of these people's lives, bringing together this technology and touch so that they can figure out a way forward. You're going to meet some patients of mine today, Sarah Beth, Lovemore, and Titus, who was cared for at the Children's Hospital, and his mother, Allison. Sarah Beth was a patient in the early 2000s who got the old way of ICU care before we had the ABCDEF bundle.
A friend of mine took me to the emergency room on Memorial Day night where they admitted me, then spent 33 days on a ventilator. Both my kidneys failed and I went on dialysis. My memories of that time being sedated are like living in a Stephen King novel. It was nightmare after nightmare after nightmare.
Medicine had to adapt over time so that we could do a better job. If you contrast her story with that of Lovemore, who's taken care of with the new way, you're going to hear him describe early on being mobilized, awake in the ICU. And that's also the way that Titus, a 4-year-old with sepsis, was cared for.
On Valentine's Day of 2018, I was outside the library in Green Hills and I got mugged and I got shot in the stomach. They were worried about whether I'd be able to walk again. So getting me off my feet during the first week that I was in the ICU was really good.
One thing that really surprised us is, and it was a brand new protocol at that time, is getting them moving as quickly as possible. Everything improved from there.
I am proud of the fact that something that happened to me improved someone else's life when they go through an illness like that.
Finding the joy and not letting what happened ruin our lives.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Beth Bailey, and I'll be your moderator this evening. I'm a freelance writer, and you can find my work in the Washington Examiner, the Federalist, Coffee or Die magazine, and the Detroit News. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Wes Ely, an alumni of Tulane. Dr. Ely has 3 degrees from Tulane, Arts and Sciences in 1985, and Doctor of Medicine and Master of Public Health degrees in 1989. He is the recipient of the Tulane Medical Alumni Association's Outstanding Alumnus Award, which he received in 2018. Dr. Ely is a professor of medicine, conducting research as a geriatric intensivist in the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine and the Center for Health Services Research at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. He is a leading ICU doctor whose unconventional methods minimize patients being harmed by the cutting-edge technologies that are saving their lives. Post-intensive care syndrome, or PICS, is a well-established complication that millions of ICU survivors battle, and that Dr. Ely aims to eradicate. His groundbreaking studies have convinced doctors around the world to change their ICU practices for the better. He and his colleagues have reintroduced humanity into the ICU, creating pathways that bring hope and healing to healthcare. This is the future of medicine. I'm thrilled to be here with all of you today to talk with Dr. Ely about his new book, Every Deep Drawn Breath, a critical care doctor on healing, recovery, and transforming medicine in the ICU, which examines Dr. Ely's journey towards rediscovering, honoring, and preserving the humanity in his critical care patients, and outlines his research into the delirium that he felt was afflicting ICU survivors with a new and devastating collection of symptoms we now know of as PICS. Every Deep Drawn Breath is filled with touching stories about the patients who inspired Dr. Ely's work as a physician, starting in his earliest frenzied days at Charity Hospital as a Tulane University medical student. But as a young physician working in critical care, human connections with sedated patients were scarce, and Dr. Ely provides an unvarnished look into the physical, mental health, and cognitive damage inflicted on voiceless patients by an endless array of medical interventions. The bulk of every deep drawn breath is dedicated to sharing these patients' stories. And just as their tales of lives upended by post-ICU conditions like depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, severe mental and physical exhaustion, and anxiety drove Dr. Ely to research delirium so that it could be combated in the ICU, their stories will give readers an empathetic look into the world of PICS, which is crucial at a time when the coronavirus is creating large numbers of ICU survivors. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Wes Ely. Dr. Ely, it's great to see you this evening.
Thank you so much, Beth. And thanks to everybody who is taking time out of their busy lives to be here with us tonight. I view this book as a tribute to all these patients and their families who were so generous to give of their lives to allow me to tell their story. And I think of myself as a pencil. I am just let me be used to tell these stories of these beautiful people and how they contributed to the evolution of medicine so that this is the future and it's a better way. And there's a lot of sad stories in this book, but there's way more hope. And you will be left, I think, uplifted and feeling great about humanity and about our culture and about what we're doing for one another. Also, I'm not afraid to address social justice issues at all. And in this book, there's quite a few things related to prejudice in this book that I want to really bring to light and to help people realize we're part of our history and that we have to face and do better. And so I hope that you enjoy those aspects of every deep drawn breath as well. Thank you, Beth, for the introduction.
Oh, absolutely. Well, you and I are going to be taking a deep dive into that patient-centric message of every deep drawn breath. And towards the end of the hour, we'll be opening up the questions from the audience. So if anyone has any questions, I know you're so eager to answer them. So you can put those in through the chat function and we'll be getting to them a little later. But I wanted to kick off the evening, Dr. Ely, with a reading from the very beginning of every deep drawn breath, where you talk about the humanity that was in constant supply at Charity Hospital, even when things like electricity were not. Could you read those early Charity recollections for us tonight?
Absolutely can. And I saw a question come up. Is that a picture of Dinwiddie Hall in the back? It looks like Dinwiddie at Tulane, but it's actually a building of one of the main part of Vanderbilt's original hospital. So I love Dinwiddie. I studied there many days. I took vertebrate morphology in Dinwiddie, and it's near and dear to my heart. So shall I get started with the opening?
That'd be great.
It was almost sunrise, and my shift was nearly over. Just a young man's leg fracture to set, and I'd be done. I stretched and looked up, and there in the trauma bay of Charity Hospital, I might add, was Ruthie the duck lady, her dirty white duck quacking from a shoebox, its neck poking through a hole in the worn cardboard top. Ruthie was a local legend, a tourist attraction, and I'd spotted her and her duck many times in the French Quarter. But this was my first time seeing her here in the hospital. Blood dripped down Ruthie's split brow. Thugs had beaten her up, and she had, like so many others in New Orleans, when a medical issue arose, trekked over to Charity Hospital to see us. I got right to work cleaning her wounds and asking a jillion long-wondered questions as I stitched her up, my voice raised above the honking of the duck. When we were done, she handed me the duck in a box and danced a frenzied jig of thanks for all of us in the emergency room, her legs flying out like Cossacks doing the hopak, and I'd rushed in to join. I'd been doing the dance since my college days, although never before with the duck in my hands. We all laughed together, only at Charity. There was no thought of paperwork. In my years there, I never saw anyone turned away, regardless of insurance status or financial means. Some payments came to us in canisters of crawfish etouffee, boiled crabs, or Cajun spiced andouille in styrofoam coolers. As Ruthie left, the new day's sun slipped through the sliding glass doors and more sick folks streamed in. I've read this a couple of times so far, and I usually stop there, but for this audience, I have to read you the next 3 paragraphs. Here they are. I'd come to New Orleans a couple of years earlier as a Tulane medical student in 1985. Charity Hospital, a 250-year-old refuge in the sweaty South, provided health care to the poorest of the poor. Its air was heavy with history. Alton Ochsner, Michael DeBakey, Rudolph Mattis, icons in medicine and surgery, had trained there decades before and left their marks of excellence. For years, Charity had been the largest hospital in the country. And at night, we medical students would sneak up to the roof on the central 20-story tower and peer over the 2,680-bed behemoth, contemplating the great chasm between where we were and where we needed to be in becoming physicians. It was a dizzying feeling. All those sick people down there who needed care, who were putting their trust in us. One such night, my roommate, Darren Portnoy, and I made a pact that we'd steer our medical journeys to help the people who needed us most, the people without a voice, perhaps the Ruthies of the world. In the 1980s, Charity functioned mainly on federal and state funds paid to hospitals caring for huge uninsured populations, and its poverty showed. We routinely ran out of bandages and gauze and filed x-rays under the patient's mattresses for safekeeping. Without a budget for phlebotomists and patient transport, the medical students and doctors in training drew all the blood and wheeled patients to their procedures. Some days the power went out, leaving windowless hallways dark and labs shuddering to a halt. We just kept on going. One night I had to hold a pen light in my mouth to deliver a baby, moving my neck to dart the angle of the beam up to the mother's face, then the blood pressure monitor, and then back down to catch the baby. The emergency room was always full, packed so tight we'd have to walk in zigzags back and forth just to get through the masses of people waiting to be tended. It was both a local clinic and a trauma center for those with the flu, advanced cancer, gunshot wounds, and everything in between. People screamed in pain, pleading for relief, the constant din of a soundtrack to our work, urging us on. The humanity at Charity ran as thick as a slow-cooked Mississippi River brown roux, and I couldn't get enough of it. Thanks, Beth.
So excellent. It's one of my favorite parts of the book. Your book is about giving a voice to your patients, but I want to talk really briefly about some of the facts of delirium in ICU patients. So on any given year, non-pandemic year, there are 6 million Americans admitted to the ICU, and about 50 to 80% of them will experience the delirium that can lead to PICS or other long-term difficulties. Your studies have found that 34% of patients admitted to the ICU with critical illness will die within 6 months of leaving. And yet, in spite of these alarming statistics, I think a lot of people outside the medical or ICU survivor communities are not familiar with PICS and delirium. So could you give us a very brief idea about how and why delirium manifests, and then what kinds of effects someone suffering with PICS might experience when they leave the ICU?
Sure, Beth, that's a great lead in. You know, delirium is a global cognitive dysfunction of the brain that leaves people unable to pay attention. We generally think of delirious patients as those having hallucinations and delusions, but that's the minority of delirious patients. The vast majority of delirious patients are what I call quiet delirium or hypoactive delirium. And it's just a little old lady sitting in the bed, minding her own business, but she can't follow the train of thought. She doesn't know what you're saying. And so 20 years ago, I developed a tool called the CAM-ICU, Confusion Assessment Method for the ICU, which is now used all over the globe, about 35, 40 languages, which just in about 30 to 40 seconds diagnoses delirium very accurately. And what we look for with delirium is simply the inability to pay attention. So if somebody asks you what delirium is on the corner one day, just say, it's a global problem of the brain where somebody can no longer pay attention. Now, every additional day of delirium increases the risk of death by 10%, and it's a tripling of the death if you just even get delirium by 6 months. And also, every additional day of delirium increases the risk of dementia by about a third, by about 30%. So what that means, and this is getting to the last part of your question, is what is PICS? PICS, post-intensive care syndrome, is when people leave critical illness and have acquired a new set of problems that they didn't have when they came in the ICU, which is really neck up dementia, post-traumatic stress disorder, and depression. And it happens about 50% cognitive impairment, about a third depression, and about 15% outright PTSD. And then a neck down problem in PICS is a myoneuropathy, a muscle nerve disease, which we call ICU acquired weakness, but makes people unable to like climb a flight of stairs, or even one or two stairs for that matter. And we have to pay attention to these problems because it creates disability for millions and millions of ICU survivors who came in fine, but leave unable to work or take care of their family.
Absolutely. And I want to start off with one of those first survivors that you met. In fact, it was right in 1989 after you graduated and started your work. So it was long before PICS existed as a diagnosis that Teresa Martin returned to you with completely new symptoms that she did not experience prior to her ICU stay. Can you tell us about Teresa's situation and how those symptoms were handled at the time in 1989?
Sure. Right before I tell about Teresa in the book, I tell about my first patient at Charity whose name was Sarah Bollock. By the way, everybody in this book is a real person. These are all real people with real stories. And if you go to our website, I wanted to remember to tell you this, we have a gallery of pictures of all these people. So when you're reading every deep drawn breath, if you just go to icudelirium.org, you can find the pictures of all these amazing people. And one of them was Sarah Bollock, and one of them is Sarah Beth. So after taking care of Sarah, I was so frustrated that I couldn't save her life, couldn't take care of her, that when I got to residency and got to take care of Teresa Martin, I was just hell-bent on doing everything I could to have her survive. And when she came in with ARDS from an errant decision to try and commit suicide, she took some tricyclic antidepressants. But even after she took them, she was like, I don't want to kill myself. I don't want to die. I regret it. And yet she aspirated and developed bad ARDS. She was on the ventilator for weeks and weeks. And when she survived eventually and got out of the hospital and came back to see me, I thought that it would be this triumphant reunion between us. You know, I was her doctor. I helped save her life. Aren't I great? And she'll come in, high-fiving me. Thank you, doc, for saving my life. I'm back at work. No, she was wheeled in, unable to really communicate. She couldn't, her mother said, why can't she move her arms and legs? And why can't she think? She had profound PICS, post-intensive care syndrome, dementia, depression, PTSD, unable to walk. And she actually had ossification in her shoulders and elbows, rocks growing in her joints from heterotopic ossification, which was from her prolonged immobilization because of me. So I had no idea what I was dealing with there. I didn't know what PICS was. This was the early 90s. And that really changed the course of my entire medical career because I became committed to try and figure out what is this problem. I feel certain I have contributed to this. And that set me in motion for the next 30 years to figure it out, reduce the problem, and serve people better.
And you absolutely did that. We saw in the video, Sarah Beth Miller, and she's one of the patients who I think is one of the most profoundly changed patients in your book, in my opinion. In 2002, she was hospitalized with pneumonia, sepsis, and acute respiratory distress syndrome. And after 5 weeks in the ICU, she had to completely relearn how to perform the job that she'd done for 30 years as an engineer with a telephone company. And you performed a battery of tests to try to understand what was going on with Sarah Beth and found that her post-ICU IQ was 2 standard deviations lower than her pre-ICU IQ of 140. And an MRI would reveal even more reasons for alarm. You write in the book about Sarah Beth's MRI results and how those made you begin to question delirium as a possible culprit for other survivors in Sarah Beth's degenerative brain issues. I think that was a big turning point from the book, and I'd love to have you read that for us right now.
I'd be happy to. Sarah Beth, by the way, is still alive. She's with us. Her picture is in the gallery, and I was with her yesterday. It's a great story. It's a sad story to us, but she feels like she has contributed to the advancement of science because she was the index patient in whom we had a pre and post IQ test. I'll read. I soon had the results in hand, and what I saw was devastating. Her previous MRI scan had not shown any signs of brain atrophy, loss of brain tissue, but this new imaging, according to the neuroradiologist, looked, quote, like the MRI of a demented 85-year-old. Sarah Beth was 52. As anyone who observes a drawing of a brain quickly notices, the outside has a wrinkled appearance made up of bumps and grooves. These are gyri and sulci. And on the interior spaces called ventricles are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. This fluid comes down from the inside of the brain into the spinal canal, and it's what doctors drain with a needle when we do a spinal tap to look for meningitis or a bleed. Since the skull encases all of this in a fixed amount of space, our heads are filled with varying amounts of brain tissue and fluid. As I stared at Sarah Beth's latest MRI, I saw immediately that she had lost a huge amount of actual tissue. The sulci were much deeper, and the ventricles filled with fluid were larger, having grown to fill the void left by disappearing brain tissue. Millions of brain cells were missing. It was as if tons of rich soil had been removed from a garden, leaving behind puddles of muddy water and a few wilted perennials. Two areas of her brain showed especially significant degeneration: the hippocampus and the frontal lobes, regions that specialize in memory and executive function. This made sense. She had told us about her forgetfulness and her inability to organize her life. It was sickening to look at it, yet I couldn't pull my eyes away. I saw the scan of Sarah Beth's badly damaged brain as a map of her muddled and tangled thinking. Visible confirmation of an invisible illness. With Sarah Beth's imaging in hand, I knew I had to find solutions to my questions about why our critically ill patients were experiencing so much delirium. I needed to get at the truth. Her scan was showing me more than a picture of mild cognitive impairment. It was more severe. Was the neuroradiologist's assessment right? Was she now demented? Could that be possible? I shook my head as if to send the thoughts flying, but it was in my mind now and unlikely to leave until I addressed it. I also knew that I had made a decision. I would follow the research track. Already, I was thinking about neuroimaging study that would take MRI images of critical care patients so that we would know if their brains, too, looked like Sarah Beth's. But there was still the crucial question: what was causing delirium?
Incredible. And as you said, Sarah Beth was in the video. Another face we saw in that video was Titus. Titus was the youngest patient you wrote about in the book at just 4 years old when he entered the ICU, and he had a particularly rough time in terms of time there. He was 6 weeks, I believe, in the ICU, and then 3 weeks additionally in rehab. And not only does Titus experience PICS as an ICU survivor, but his family also experiences what is termed PICS-F. Could you talk about Titus's story and then tell us a little bit about the impact of PICS-F on survivors' families?
Sure. Titus is a beautiful boy, isn't he? You see him in the video with his glasses. He's so cute. He came in with what we refer to in the Deep South as rip-roaring sepsis. It was horrendous. Every organ was failing. It was just so rapidly advancing. He was in full-blown septic shock on the ventilator. Titus was very aggressively cared for with the A2F bundle. That's the letter A, number 2, and then letter F. That's the ABCDEF bundle, which is really a string of 6 letters that signify 6 safety steps that we use in the ICU as a checklist, much like a pilot would use a checklist to get you safely from LA to New York to make sure everything was taken care of. This is the safety checklist that we developed, evidence-based. We've now studied well over 30,000 people with this checklist. And Titus is a great example of how we now apply this checklist in pediatric ICUs as well. So very early on, we were waking him up, getting him out of bed, walking him on the ventilator, and it made all the difference. Titus had extremity modeling and some digits that looked like they weren't going to make it because of ischemia. But he did make it, and he kept his digits. And I think that made a huge difference in his life to get that bundle that early, like you heard his mother say. The thing, though, that happened was that when they went home, and there's an incredible story in the book about when she goes home, and she says that all these mothers got together like an emergency packet for her, which had chocolate and booze in it. And she doesn't even drink. And she got in the house, and I won't spoil it, but all hell breaks loose in the house that night because everybody's yelling and screaming. They all feel terribly out of control. And she went straight for that booze, because she had to have some sort of relief. That is what PICS-F is all about, post-intensive care syndrome of the family. This is a family disease. Addiction like alcoholism, that disease is a family disease too. It affects the entire family. And that's what happens in critical care units, is that everybody's life is involved. And so all of them, Allison, the mother, the husband, all the kids, they're all in therapy in different sorts. And they don't mind me telling this. They've signed HIPAA release forms and they are very involved in advocacy for this problem.
That is excellent. I want to touch on another phenomenon that can impact ICU survivors that you write about really beautifully, because they're the stories of these patients. But ICU patients can experience very realistic and terrifying hallucinations during their stay in the ICU. And those can continue to impact them in the form of nightmares and other disturbances for the rest of their lives. Now that you're working with the Critical Illness, Brain Dysfunction and Survivorship Center, or the CIBS Center at Vanderbilt University, you hear a lot about these patients' experiences in various group therapy sessions. I think there are online and virtual attendees from around the world. Could you read from us the section of Every Deep Drawn Breath where you talk about one of those sessions and the patients are discussing the hallucinations that they experience? Because I think they're just such a vivid representation of what someone might be going through when they're in the ICU.
Absolutely. And you all will see me occasionally blowing my nose. I've got terrible allergic rhinitis, and the pollen in this town in Nashville right now is going crazy. So that's all that I'm doing there. Kyle nodded. He seemed eager to share. Well, everything was in vivid color. So I'm on a ventilator and I woke up and my wife, Katie, was sitting next to me trying to tell me what was going on. I looked over my shoulder, just glanced up to the right, and my monitor was there. But behind it, I saw a black jaguar perched up in the corner in pounce position, moving its tail real slow. I remember getting upset. Katie thought it was about the monitor and being hooked up and said, "It's okay. It's helping you breathe." But I was thinking, there's an apex predator in the corner. Are we going to pretend this cat isn't about to pounce and tear us all apart? He paused for a moment. I was convinced that if I took my eyes off it, then this thing was going to kill us all. My hands were restrained, so I couldn't even defend myself. That went on for about a full day, and everyone thought I was looking at the monitor. And that was upsetting because I was thinking, I'm not the crazy here. You guys don't see this thing? Kyle's experience with delirium in the ICU was one of the worst I had seen in a long time. In addition to the black jaguar, he believed he was a crew member on a research vessel heading to the Arctic Circle to study sperm whales. And another time, he thought the nurses were witches. After we removed him from the ventilator, his delirium quickly deteriorated into catatonia. His muscle movements froze and he couldn't raise his arms. This condition is known as catalepsy and McGahan. When we lifted his hand up into the air slightly, it stayed perched there or even continued to rise involuntarily until it looked as if he were pointing to the top of the Batman building of the Nashville skyline out his window. He could keep that pose for hours. Now, the next morning, he became completely mute. He appeared to be awake, but for 36 hours, he did not speak a word. Later, he told us that during his mutism, he was flying an airplane and the ICU monitors were his instrument panel. How real did the jaguar look, I asked? As if the beast walked into the room right now, and that's the weirdest thing. How clear those hallucinations still are, and everything else is real foggy. Kyle's voice was shaking, and Katie put her hand on his shoulder. They had weathered a lot together. I'd been happy to hear them say once they'd grown closer because of it. Delirium is not an easy thing to handle. It's the stuff of Stephen King novels, said Sarah Beth, nodding. I dreamed I was drowning, added Richard, in a font, a baptismal font. The delirium stories flooded in. There were so many of them.
It's just incredible. These experiences were so vivid and real. for these patients. And yet for years, the medical community was either unaware of them or reticent to look into delirium and change ICU practices. And there's so much in the book about that whole reticence in that period when you were trying to study delirium, but people kept telling you, you don't need to do that right now. No one's going to fund that. Can you talk a little bit about those reactions to your desire to study what you felt was afflicting these survivors?
Yeah, Beth, one of the things that we all have to do is discern our vocation. And all the listeners tonight are some of them are discerning a change in their life or the next step. And I really do believe it's a beautiful process. I call it a meanwhile. And we know that when we plant seeds in a garden, there's a lot of time that goes by that we don't see anything happen, but there's a lot going on under the ground. And so in my own discernment, I had to figure out, am I going to take care of an N of one patient, which is a beautiful thing to do. And in practice, I love doing that still at the bedside, or am I going to try and get to the bottom of this? So I made a decision to do research alongside my clinical practice. But what happened was a lot of people kept calling me in the office saying, Wes, this is not a thing. Like, you're never going to get NIH funding for this. It's a bad decision career-wise. You're going to end up, not being able to stay afloat academically. And I got really discouraged. And I thought, wow, maybe I'm crazy. And the first grants I put in all got just summarily rejected by the NIH and the VA. And I kept having to revamp and kind of go back to the drawing board. And it was very difficult. And I questioned myself a lot. And then finally, we broke the ice, broke the glass ceiling, and got some funding. And I've been funded by the NIH and the VA for now over 20 years. And it's been a blessing, but none of this stuff is easy. And once you try and design the studies to find the answers, even when you find the truth, doesn't mean that people will listen. And that's been the second part, is getting people to hear this message, which is one of the reasons I wrote Every Deep Drawn Breath. I wanted to give some autonomy to patients and families who were being poo-pooed by us, by a doctor like me, and saying, I don't think there's a problem here, when they know there's a problem.
Absolutely. And the A2F bundle, which you mentioned earlier, I was going to ask you more about it, but I don't think we really need to talk about the specifics of the A2F bundle as much as we can talk about, I want to talk about some of the things that it can do that are not just based on the bundles, each step of the bundle, but there's a role that the A2F bundle has in, for instance, alleviating physician burnout, which affects, according to a pre-pandemic study, up to 50% of physicians. And that seems like a remarkable opportunity for change. And that's all through the human connections that can be forged between patients and medical teams, because with the A2F bundle, patients are aware, they are present, they're interacting more. Can you explain how that works and where you've seen it happen? Maybe an instant with a patient where you've really felt that human connection and it's made you feel more invigorated about your practicing medicine.
Sure. Let me tell you about Janet Keith. Janet Keith, she's in the book. She is I called her, she laughs because when she was on the ventilator and sedated, she had necrotizing fasciitis of her face. So we had taken off most of her face in order for her to survive. She was on the ventilator. And I used to whisper in her ear, there was a picture right in front of her going to Paris and standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. And I said, you are my refined badass. That's what I called her. And every day on the ventilator, we would turn her sedation off, wake her up, get her out of the bed and walk her, so that the first day that she passed her spontaneous breathing trial, which is a way of testing the patient to see if they can come off the ventilator, the very first day she did that, she got extubated and she walked 100 feet in the hall. Now, had we not been doing the A2F bundle all the days before, she would not have even been able to get out of the bed on that first day. And many of our listeners know that in the old way, you get somebody off the ventilator and they sit in the bed, parked there for another week. Well, we don't do that anymore. And to me, this is about rehumanization. So imagine you have this filter here and you have people walking into the ICU, and here's the ICU over here. I think what we did in the 90s was we installed a depersonalization chamber. And when the people came into the ICU, they came in color, with loves, dislikes, food they enjoyed, music they loved. We put them through this depersonalization chamber. On the other side of it, it was all gray tones. Everybody's gray. Everybody's in the bed. Everybody's sedated, immobilized. I can't tell who you are. I can't talk to you. I can't find out what matters to you. Forget about what's the matter with someone. Pay attention instead to what matters to someone. Switch that preposition from what's the matter with to what matters to. So what the bundle is essentially about, Beth, is saying you are a whole person in that bed there. And I see you. And you've got I see you like an intensive period. I see you and you have dignity, and I want to show you respect. And I'm going to wake you up, find out what matters to you, lift you up as a person, and provide healing. That's the first thing that the bundle's about. But I don't want to forget to tell you, it's also about respect during the dying process. Many of our patients won't live. And what the bundle does is allow somebody to have less delirium so they can talk to the people they love as they're dying, and maybe even reconcile relationships, have healing moments. So it's really for all components of critical care. And I just love that piece of it, that it's a repersonalization chamber instead of a depersonalization chamber.
That part that you just talked about, the end of life care, that was going to be my next question, because really those stories in the book about the times when you were able to provide that closure and the togetherness for patients with their families, instead of having them, immobile, not able to converse, etc. They were so powerful. I was in tears on rereading a section. It would make me cry the second time. So I wasn't going to share that part tonight, but there you go, off the cuff.
But while you're on that, let me say this. You asked about burnout.
Yes.
I think that the bundle is a burnout prevention program. And the reason is that when we are discerning what our path is in life, many of us decide that we want to bring healing and reduce suffering for people around us. When we do that, holding hands and making eye contact with the people that we're there to serve, we get much larger of an impact and a payback of why we are there. Because during COVID, we basically instituted a program which I call anti-medicine. During COVID, we brought back benzos, we brought back more sedation, and we got rid of the bundle at the beginning. We were afraid. And so we treated people in what I think was an inhumane way. And I actually think it was a form of injustice. It was a form of social injustice, testimonial injustice, because we're silencing our patient. And it was also epistemic injustice. Episteme is knowledge. So epistemic injustice is when we hold knowledge and I'm holding the cards and I don't relay it to you, so you're locked out. I don't want to be that person in the ICU anymore, Beth. I don't want to be that doctor. And to me, the path of every deep drawn breath is my own processing of my guilt and shame for the way that I practiced medicine for too long.
Absolutely. And you're so candid about that throughout the book. It's very clear. It's a path towards redemption. And I think that it's just the whole book is so powerful. It's filled with things that make anybody think, whether you're a doctor or not, about your path and your calling and what you can be doing better. I think you've distilled that so beautifully. Would you want to share any stories of particular patients who you saw through that end of life process, even during the COVID days? There are some really moving stories about patients during that COVID pandemic who were not able to be with their family or who were at the very end. There were so many. I'd love to hear you share one of those stories.
I'll tell you one right now. We have time. Colonel Correa. Colonel Correa was a 9/11 hero. He was an officer in the Pentagon when 9/11 occurred and the bomb hit. And Colonel Correa was 5 feet away from death when that bomb hit. He said it was, on the other 5 feet of the room, everybody died. And on his 5 feet of the room, we didn't die. So he, on that heroic day, he didn't think of himself as a hero, but he put people on his back and carried them out, dislocated his hip, walked home. This is hard to hear, but with flesh on him, took a shower and came back to the Pentagon. Well, many years later, I walked into the VA and he was there with lymphoma and had been through chemotherapy and was profoundly septic and was very, very weak. He had been immobilized for too long, and I saw a man in the bed who wanted his family there. It was during COVID. His family was not present. And I thought, this is completely wrong. The family is not a luxury in this situation. For Colonel Correa, they are part of the treatment plan, and they have to be there. So I worked with, Reed argued, with the administration, and we got the family at his bedside, and his wife and children were there. The very first day that I was on service, we got him into a big bear hug and got him out of the bed. And I call it, you have to dance before you can walk, dangle before you dance, and then dance before you walk. So they dangle on the edge of the bed first, then they dance, and then they walk. And so it usually is just a big bear hug thing where he's hugging me and I'm hugging him. And we got him up, moved him, and he said, "Doctor, I'm back to the land of the living." That's the phrase I love to give. And he said it first. And it was such an uplifting thing to see Colonel Correa go through all of this. Not that I was under the illusion that he was going to live. I knew he wasn't going to live. Well, I felt he wasn't going to live. And I still wanted to provide him the dignity that he desired during those dying days. And so he did perceive that he got a lot of dignity during those dying days. And when he passed away, we were all holding hands. His family was all around him. And when he took his last breath, Lydia, his wife, looked up at the clock, and it was 9:11 on the dot. And we just, whoa, it was amazing. So that's just one of numerous experiences in the book that I want to share with you. And the point of these stories is to realize the magnitude of humanity and the glory that we are there to be a part of. In fact, every deep drawn breath comes from Steinbeck's East of Eden. And in that chapter 13, the part of the prose that I love so much is really about the glory of humanity and also our foibles and our mistakes, all mixed in together. But that's what we are, is a big mash, mess of ups and downs and humanity, and in death, all of that is present, but we want to lift the person up. So thank you for letting me tell that story.
Oh, absolutely. That is the story that always gets me. It's so beautiful. You did a lot for Colonel Correa and his family. You brought up where the title of the book comes from, and actually that makes me think about your trip to Odense. I'm hoping I'm not totally butchering that pronunciation, but that was where you say that you first felt that kind of oneness with life, where you finally saw the opportunities ahead. And there were some things that you saw there that actually I was going to ask about later, methods to improve the patient experience, like the ICU diary, for instance. You saw that at work there. What other things did you get from that experience, the trip to Denmark, that kind of made you want to push through?
Sure. The evolution of critical care, which is told through these patient stories, took place all over the world. We were in Korea, all over Africa, Latin America, Asia, and one of the key stories was in Scandinavia. And a guy named Thomas Strom invited me there, and they were doing no sedation. They had all their patients off sedation, and I didn't believe it. I tell about Hans Christian Andersen, The Emperor Has No Clothes, and these fairy tales, because that's where he was from. And I thought I was going to go see a fairy tale. But when I went into those ICUs, everybody was awake. They were all wide awake on the ventilator with an E2 tube down. And it was a beautiful thing to see. And I finally realized, oh my gosh, this is totally possible. In fact, I knew that in the United States back in the 70s, we did walk people on ventilators, but I was so entrenched in what I'd learned in the 80s and 90s that I thought it wasn't possible. But I realized that Thomas Strom, the Emperor did have clothes on. It was real, and it wasn't a fairy tale. And the town is called Odense. And in Odense, when I was there, they had these diaries. It's spelled D-A-G-B-O-G, but it's pronounced Daibo. And these Daibos were these daily diaries where they would write down what was going on. And so we've now begun to do that. and we keep track of what's happening with each of our patients. And it's a way of them getting healing on the back end of their critical care stay, because they can go back and say, oh gosh, that was the day that I thought that I was in a game show shooting people, but I was just delirious and that was my ventilator going off or something. They can put the pieces back together.
It's an incredible, such a simple thing, but it is really important. It's one of the things that you mentioned, that these patients, when they can't remember, it's very hard for them. So you're filling in a big gap. I have one audience question I want to get to, but before that, I wanted to wrap up our part of the discussion tonight by talking about a theme that I see running just throughout every deep drawn breath. And that's the importance of active goodness in medical practice. And I think you can take that lesson and just put it through life. But in your introduction, you talk about the difference between benevolence, wishing good, and beneficence, doing good. Could you elaborate on that distinction and tell us what you've seen beneficence accomplish that benevolence alone would not have been able to accomplish?
Sure, yeah. I do believe that I always intended benevolence, which is wishing good, but I do not believe that I was achieving beneficence, doing good. I did a lot of harm to people. And I know that, and I've got to face the fact that I hurt people. And in my life as a physician, I feel that we have a commitment to beneficence, not to benevolence. And so I believe that it is my duty to bring that into the lives of my patients. And, Osler wrote a famous essay, Equanimitas. And in Equanimitas, he talks about this distance that we need to create with our patients so that we don't get injured and hurt personally when somebody dies, et cetera. I tend to go to extremes, and I took that too far and separated myself from my patients. And that Equanimitas became actually an overused asset of mine, where I was too far removed from the patients and their loved ones. I've had to unlearn that. And I think that I am a more beneficent doctor now, because I now got rid of that whole idea of keeping an even keel all the time and not letting my relationships get mixed up. There's a story I tell in every deep drawn breath about Shonda. And you may remember it was the end of one of the chapters, and Shonda had HLH, which is a terrible disease of your bone marrow. And she and I got so close that it was a brutal experience when she did die. And I won't tell the reader what happened after she died, but I talked about when I was walking down the hall and felt that her body was still in that room and what happened. And I'll let the reader figure that out. But I'm now glad as a doctor that I'm willing to have those experiences. I think it makes me more real. It makes me more human. And before, I was pretending that I wasn't being affected, and I was shoving my feelings under the rug. But those feelings have got to come out somewhere. And they can come out as anger, they can come out as frustration, sadness. In my case, they came out as control. I was like an ultra controller, but it wasn't good for my patients and loved ones. So I'm really thankful that I've actually gone to therapy to get rid of this. And I mean, this whole book has been my therapy,
I wondered how that felt, the process of getting all of that out. And it's just beautiful. I will do the audience question. Then I think I might have one more about Catholicism, if that's acceptable.
No problem.
Okay. So this is a question from Dr. Jane Todd, and she wondered, what approach have you found most helpful in talking to family that refused to give DNR?
People who refuse to give a DNR, my approach to them is to talk and listen and talk. Listen a lot. Why do you not want a DNR? A lot of times it's driven out of fear, and fear makes people react. So it's not always fear. It may be just a deeply held belief that they don't believe in not doing everything. But the vast majority of the time, if I listen closely enough to the reasons they don't want the patient to be made comfort measures and focus on palliation when we think the patient's very actively dying, in almost all circumstances, we can come to an agreement if we focus on what mattered to the patient instead of what's the matter with the patient. Getting back to that thing I said earlier. So I try and redirect our mind and our conversation about what matters to the person. And even if the person had said, I want everything done, we can get to a point where we say, everything has been done. It's all been done, and it didn't work. And now it's the humble thing and the beneficent thing is to not prolong the suffering. And we usually can come to figure out and get on the same page.
That's an incredibly good answer. Well, there's a section in the book you talk about being a Catholic, and you talk about being able to deliver the host to a doctor who's there. It's a really moving section. Would you tell us a little about that story as well this evening?
Sure. Let me preface that by saying, and I'm not just paying this lip service, I am fascinated by different people's spiritual paths. And I love learning about Judaism and Islam and Hinduism and all the great religions of the world. And one of the stories I tell in the book is about one of my favorite patients ever, who was atheist, who did this incredibly beautiful ritual as she was dying. So I really try to show the respect that all these different paths deserve in every deep drawn breath. And there's only one place. This is not a religious book, but there is only one place in the entire book where I reveal my own spiritual foundation. And I'm Catholic, and I was brought up Catholic. And on this one occasion, Giancarlo Piano, who we can use, all these people's names are real. Giancarlo was a cardiothoracic surgeon. And he called me a week before he was admitted. He said, I've got COVID. What are we going to do? And I started helping him just through emailing and such. We'd known each other years earlier. And eventually, Giancarlo's COVID gets worse enough to where he's admitted to the ICU. And one day he was on a high flow nasal cannula and huffing and puffing and desaturating. And I asked him, I said, he's devout Catholic. I said, would you want me to bring you the Eucharist? And he said, oh my gosh, totally. And I did. I brought it to him. And he started breathing so fast, he started desaturating a little bit. I was actually afraid, Giancarlo, laugh with me here. I was afraid that he might desaturate in codes. I said, Giancarlo, please take deep breaths. Let's slow down. But he was so thankful. He called it his golden ticket. And this is what the point I want to make is that if we respect people's spiritual paths and treat them as a whole person, mind, body, and spirit, then we can achieve something of almost mystical quality in our physician-patient relationship. And that's really our goal, is to connect with somebody on that level so that they know that I'm respecting all of them. And that's what happened with Giancarlo. It was, to me, the greatest thing that I could have done for him. He eventually goes on to die many days later, but his wife, his family, everybody said that was the most important thing that happened to him in the hospital. And so I do the similar rituals for Jewish patients and Hindus and Muslims, et cetera. So it doesn't matter what the religion is. We want to honor that person.
Absolutely. It's one of the most important things, as you talk about in that whole section about end of life care, being able to fulfill the final spiritual needs. I want to thank Jane for that question. It was great earlier. If there were any questions that we missed, Dr. Ely will be sending you a personal response via email in the future. Before we close things up tonight, Dr. Ely, I want to let you have any final comments or thoughts about the book and this evening.
Well, I'm not the central figure of this book. This is not a memoir. It's a book about other people, and it's a tribute to their lives. I don't think we've said this yet, but this book, every penny from this book is being donated to patients and families. So this is a mission to try and give money back and support people who've suffered through critical illness. Every penny, as I said, net proceeds will go back into a fund called the EDDB, that's Every Deep Drawn Breath fund at Vanderbilt, and we're going to use it, and it's going to be directed by patients and families. So what's really happening in my life as a doctor is that COVID has made me kind of double down on the desire to do my best for other people. And right now we're having these Delta surges. It's a brutal time in our country. and our ICUs are all filled back up again with COVID patients. We have a lot of very afraid people who are having a hard time getting vaccinated. But what I'm finding is that if I sit there and talk to patients in the hospital, and even the non-COVID patients, many of them will share their fears with me. I'll listen to those things, help them get educated about their misunderstandings of misinformation. And many of them we vaccinate right up there in the ICU. So don't lose hope. Stay focused on listening to each other. And if we can, instead of pulling each other apart, use every deep drawn breath. It allows these people to pull us back together again so that we can serve people better. That's, I hope, the take home of the message that our listeners are getting tonight.
I think that's exactly it. And I just want to thank you so much for sharing this important book and all of these really amazing stories with us. It's likely that everyone listening tonight will one day experience an ICU stay or have a loved one in the ICU. And so the information in Every Deep Drawn Breath is an absolutely vital tool for advocacy and empathy. And not just the book itself, you also have appendices at the end that are geared towards medical professionals or towards patients and survivors and their loved ones. So it's chock full of great information in language that can be understood, enjoyed, and acted upon by readers that are in the medical field and those outside of it. Every Deep Drawn Breath really underscores the most important aspect of critical care, and I think of life itself, which is nurturing human connections. The A2F bundle gets to the heart of what medicine strives to do too, which is preserving the full life of a patient, something that can best be accomplished if a physician understands that patient's circumstances, their desires, and their needs. In this really moving and multifaceted book, Dr. Ely, you've challenged all of us to be more attuned to the unique humanity in the people around us. And you've asked us to join this healthcare army that is aiming to reform the world of critical care in favor of ICU patients. And it's just really beautiful and incredible work. You can find this book anywhere books are sold and on Audible, where it's read by Grover Gardner and Dr. Wes Ely. Again, I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. It's been an excellent evening, and thank you to Dr. Ely and Tulane University for having me. Again, if you had a question and it was not answered, you'll be getting a personal response from Dr. Ely. And also, this whole evening was recorded, so everyone should be getting a recording within the next few days. And then I just hope you guys all have a great evening. Thanks for being here again, and stay well.
Thanks. And one of the ways you can pay it forward is to leave a book review. These book reviews are very helpful for drawing others towards the message. And so I'd really appreciate that. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.